When you picture the birth of America, what do you see? Maybe it's a painting, well-dressed pilgrims stepping onto Plymouth Rock, shaking hands with Native Americans, and sitting down for a big turkey dinner. We imagine freedom, we imagine destiny, but the truth. The truth was mud, disease, and death. It was a nightmare. When the first English settlers arrived in Jamestown in 1607, they didn't find a paradise. They found a swamp. Within just 6 months. Half of them were dead, and that Thanksgiving turkey. Forget it. During a period they called the starving time, they ate their horses, their leather boots, and eventually, each other. This isn't the story of a nation destined for greatness. This is the story of a desperate, bloody gamble. Before there was a United States, there was just a collection of terrified people, clinging to the edge of a hostile continent, trying to survive the elements, the natives, and their own greed. This is the brutal birth of America. To really understand the United States, you have to get that there were two different foundings, and the first one wasn't about God or freedom. It was about cold, hard cash. The Virginia Company of London wasn't sending families to build a new society. They were sending employees to get rich. In 1607, they landed in what they named Jamestown. They were looking for gold. What they found was malaria. The men who arrived were so-called gentlemen adventurers, guys who considered manual labor beneath them. They refused to plant crops or build proper shelters. It took a tough-as-nails leader named John Smith to impose martial law, famously declaring, "He who shall not work shall not eat." Even then, the colony was a catastrophic failure. It was on the verge of collapse until they finally found their gold. It just wasn't the shiny metal kind. It was green tobacco. A settler named John Rolfe smuggled in a new, sweeter strain of tobacco from the Caribbean, and it became an instant sensation back in Europe. Suddenly, the failing colony had a purpose. Jamestown became a boomtown, the first of many in American history. But there was a problem. Tobacco is incredibly labor-intensive. It needs a lot of land and a lot of hands. At first, they used a system of indentured servitude. Poor white people from England would sign a contract, selling 7 years of their lives in exchange for a ticket across the ocean. Life for them was brutal, but at the end of their term, they were technically free. But that system wasn't enough to satisfy the hunger for profit. Then, in 1619, a Dutch ship arrived, carrying a different kind of cargo, 20 and odd captive Africans. This is the moment many historians call America's original sin. The drive for profit, which had saved the colony from starvation, now planted the poisonous seeds of chattel slavery. The economy of the entire American South began to lock itself into a system built on human bondage, a decision that would lead directly to the Civil War over 2 centuries later. The colony survived, but at a terrible moral cost. Now, while Virginia was chasing money, a completely different group arrived up north. In 1620, the ship we all know, the Mayflower, landed in modern-day Massachusetts. These were the Pilgrims, and a decade later, a much larger group called the Puritans would follow. They weren't looking for wealth. They were looking for God. They wanted to build what they called a city upon a hill, a perfect religious society. That would be a beacon to the world. But let's kill a big myth right now. The Puritans did not believe in freedom of religion. They believed in freedom for their religion, and that's it. If you were a Quaker, a Catholic, or just disagreed with the church leaders in Massachusetts, you weren't welcomed with open arms. You were whipped, you were banished, or in some cases, you were hanged. Their society was rigid, conformist, and intolerant of dissent, life. In New England was starkly different from Virginia. The climate was colder, the soil was rocky, and it was actually much healthier. Fewer mosquitoes meant less malaria and other diseases. And unlike the single men who first came to Jamestown, the Puritans arrived as families. Because of this, their population exploded naturally. They built their lives around 2 central buildings, the church and the town hall. This fostered a unique culture of community, high literacy because everyone needed to read the Bible, and intense government oversight into people's daily lives. So you have these two distinct English cultures taking root in America. In the South, a sprawling, aristocratic society of planters was emerging, built on cash crops and slave labor. In the North, a tight-knit, commercial society of merchants, artisans, and religious zealots was forming in dense little towns. These two groups, the planter and the Puritan, had already disliked each other back in England. Now they were neighbors on a vast new continent, and their differences would only grow deeper over time. Of course, we can't talk about this era without talking about the people who were already here for thousands of years, that first Thanksgiving story. It was less about friendship and more about a temporary political alliance. As the English colonies grew, they needed one thing above all else: land. Land for tobacco, land for cattle, land for their growing families. This constant expansion inevitably led to conflict and war. The most important war you probably never learned about in school was King Philip's War in 1675. A brilliant Wampanoag leader named Metacomet, whom the English called King Philip, united various tribes across New England in a desperate, last-ditch effort to drive the colonists into the sea. It was an absolute apocalypse. Per capita, it was the bloodiest war in American history. 5% of the entire English colonial population was killed. Dozens of towns were burned to the ground. It was a terrifying existential struggle. In the end, the English colonists, with their greater numbers and resources, won. The victory was savage. They captured Metacomet, beheaded him, and mounted his head on a pike outside of Plymouth. It stayed there for 20 years as a gruesome warning. This brutal war proved something terrifying, not just to the native tribes, but to the British Crown watching from across the ocean. The American colonists were ruthless. They were incredibly resilient, and they were starting to fight their own battles, their own way. They were becoming something different. By the year 1750, the desperate, starving time was a distant memory. The 13 colonies were established and booming. In fact, they had one of the highest standards of living in the entire world. But they weren't Americans yet. A wealthy planter in Virginia still saw himself as a British gentleman living abroad. A merchant in Boston still saw himself as a pious British subject. They had almost nothing in common with each other, except for one critical thing. They had all survived. They had survived the treacherous ocean crossing. They had survived starvation. And they had survived brutal wars. A new character was being forged in this crucible, fiercely independent, stubborn, and deeply suspicious of any authority trying to tell them what to do. They didn't know it yet, but the fuse of revolution was already lit. All it needed was a spark. Join us next time for part 2, where a foolish mistake by a young, ambitious officer named George Washington accidentally sets the entire world on fire and puts the colonies on a collision course with the British Empire. Please like and subscribe for more Us History.